Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of some recent reading. And by recent, I actually mean not so recent because I've gotten massively behind on these. So I'm going to try to divide them up into somewhat thematic groupings to try to get through everything. So this one is going to be just everything I read over the past month or so that was translated from Spanish. So the first book that I'll talk about is Jorge Consiglio's Fate. This was translated by Carolina Orloff and Fionn Petch, and it is, on the surface, it's about the lives of two couples, one a couple who are just starting out in a relationship, possibly, and we're just seeing if it turns into a real relationship, and another couple whose marriage is falling apart, and all of this is set in and around Buenos Aires. Now, having said that, this is not actually a relationship drama. Because of the title and because of the way the first chapter is written, there are certain expectations that the reader ends up going in with that are played with and kind of thwarted in interesting ways. And the final few pages are writing back to that first chapter. And because of that, I think it's almost a fascinating meta-experiment of how the author is communicating with the reader at a level that isn't actually about the story that they're telling. So I think that's really fascinating. This is super short, and I know a lot of books that play with that kind of thing are not short. So if you are interested in that kind of play with theme and meta level discussion, I think this is well worth picking up. Although I will note, I know some people don't like to read about taxidermy and don't like to read about infidelity, and both of those things feature in here. But otherwise, I think this is really interesting, not so much for the story, but for the way the expectations are being played with. So that was great. As I said, it's short, so I'm not going to say a lot about it because it's not story-driven, so I can't really spoil anything. But part of what's delightful about it is seeing how the different characters act, react, and how their lives intersect or don't. So, yeah, highly recommended. Good stuff. So that was fun. In a way that I didn't expect, because I kind of expected a relationship drama, which I don't normally like, but I had put a bunch of charcoal press books on hold at the library, and I only read it because it happened to be the length I was looking for, but I'm glad I did because, yeah, very entertaining stuff. Next up, I have a book of short stories. This is Rodrigo Fuentes' Trout Belly Up. This was translated by Ellen Jones, and these are a series of short stories that might be interconnected or might not be. A lot of them have a character called Henrik, who in some of them seems to be a Guatemalan with Norwegian heritage. Sometimes he's just a Norwegian immigrant. Sometimes he maybe is somebody who just did business in Norway. And that Henrik character or characters appears in most of the story, but never as the primary character. So we're always looking at people who are kind of peripheral to him. So in some cases he owns a trout farm, as in the title, and we're talking to one of the workers. There's another one where we're talking to somebody who's connected to workers on a different farm, where there's a stepson. There's one story in here that doesn't appear to have that character, but may have one of the secondary other characters interweaving into it. So you could read these as interconnected, but I think they don't necessarily have to be, and the author did write these over a series of years, so they weren't written as a single work to begin with, so I don't think you have to, but it's interesting, almost an interesting puzzle to try to figure out if this character is the same person who just happens to have the same name, or if this is just a weird theme that we have this guy with the Norwegian association wandering through the story, and in the background, which is also interesting because I think, again, kind of playing with expectations, you expect that at some point we're going to hear from this character that keeps appearing, and we don't. I don't know if that's a spoiler. I feel like it almost is, even though it has nothing to do with any of the stories. But yeah, really good stuff. A lot of play with discussions of class and family relationships and agriculture and social pressures. So good stuff. Again, this is a book that I went into purely because I had put a bunch of charcoal press titles on hold, and again, I was very entertained by it. So next up I have Ariana Harwitz's Feebleminded. This was translated by Annie McDermott and Carolina Orloff, who was one of the translators on one of those other books. This is a deeply weird novella in which we are following a pair of characters who are a mother and daughter who are deeply disturbed emotionally and mentally, maybe, there isn't really dialogue, although we sometimes hear what should be dialogue, but it's always through the minds of the characters, so it's very stream of consciousness, but through the minds of people who have a really disturbing relationship, both to each other and to reality. So this was a book that I didn't enjoy, but it was interesting to read just because it was very clearly doing what it was setting out to do. And while I didn't enjoy the process of reading it, I think it's really interesting stylistically, and I think especially if you are interested in a kind of disturbing stream of consciousness style of writing and all of that, I think this is well worth picking up. Interestingly, I read an article about the author's opinion on the translation, which was very positive, because that is something that I often wonder about, especially when it's something that is as intentionally weird as this. Like, are we getting the right kind of weirdness? And apparently we are in this, so that's kind of good to know. So that was, I hesitate to say good stuff, because as I said, I did not enjoy this. I found this, how would I put it? Graphic in a way that isn't necessarily like, oh, this is graphic violently or sexually, just graphic in terms that it would describe things in the ugliest and most unattractive way possible, and then often it is violent or sexual on top of that, but it's a unique kind of graphicness that is clearly being written that way to make the reader uncomfortable, and so that it was uncomfortable is definitely a sign that it succeeded, but whether you enjoy reading that, will depend on a lot of tastes and whether you're interested in that kind of thing. So yeah, as I said, interesting, but I didn't like it. Next up, I have a piece of nonfiction, and this is Reinaldo Arenas' Before Night Falls, and this was translated by Dolores M. Koch. This was turned into a movie a number of years ago, and it is the author's memoir of growing up in Cuba, being a political prisoner, and then living in New York City while he was essentially dying of AIDS. He committed suicide before the disease actually killed him, but we follow him basically right up until the moment of his death. I picked this up a year and a half ago when that box set of the Penguin Vitae books was on sale, but I chose to pick it up at this particular time because Jen the librarian and Greg from Supposedly Fun, who are running an LGBTQ books in translation read-along where they pick 2 books every 2 months, and this was the main book for these past 2 months, so I thought I'd read along there. The interesting thing about this is that the first, I would say half of it, is a lot of macho posturing about sexual encounters. And I think when you read about this, there will be some people who say this is just machismo, but in a gay way rather than the heterosexual way that you're used to seeing it. And then the other argument that I've seen is that it is poking at a political regime that essentially said that homosexuality didn't exist in Cuba, and so the author was presenting it as, no, this was everywhere. Look at all the orgies on the beach. So that's kind of interesting at a meta level. I think whether you want to read about all of these sexual encounters, and on the Discord for the read-along group, there were a lot of people saying, I didn't really care about all these encounters, but it does feel like it's being done intentionally. And then the book sort of ramps up at the end as he's getting to the end of his life, both, I think, because he was actively dying at that point. It also just becomes a little more interesting because he is then talking more about the politics and his time in prison. He talks about choosing to be celibate while he was in prison, so that might be an improvement if all of the sexual bragging bits are a turnoff, but also, and for me, I tend to be drawn to political prisoner memoirs, and that was the main reason that I wanted to read this while the group was reading it, so I was interested in that part. I also found the final section, which is the shortest section where he's living in the US, to be really interesting. He talks in there about a lot of publishers who had kind of leftist leanings, especially in Europe, were willing to publish his work while he was living in Cuba. When he was having his books banned and when he was imprisoned in Cuba, they were willing to publish them as sort of a dissident writer. But as soon as he'd moved to the US, the publishers were no longer interested. By leaving, they were no longer interested in his point of view, as though becoming a refugee had invalidated whatever he'd experienced earlier. And I thought that was really interesting because I think that is something that I talked about this a couple of weeks ago when I was talking about a Montenegrin writer who hadn't emigrated, but people would put the lie out there that he had, because that would somehow invalidate what he had to say. And that, it's such an odd thing that, you know, if you choose to, like, I would like to not go to prison again, so you leave the country, and that suddenly means his opinions aren't interesting anymore. And so I thought that was fascinating in terms of what the publishers of the time, and we're talking the late 80s at that point, were looking for, and what kind of messaging they wanted to send out, and what was safe or not. Although I guess maybe a certain amount of bigger picture is necessary there, because I feel like a lot of discussions about Cuba until recently always talk about the US boycotts and the ban on travel and whatnot. Whereas if you're in Canada or Europe, it's always been, well, this is a cheap place you go on vacation. And which is also a kind of colonial way to view a place, right? It's also very paternal, just in a very different way than the way the US was viewing it. So that's kind of interesting external to the book. But yeah, I thought the prison parts in this and the bits about publishing and his experience then once he was in exile was really fascinating. The macho posturing at the beginning, yeah, may not be for everyone. He also describes some childhood experiences on the farm that, you know, are definitely on the edge of bestiality, that, you know, I don't know that I needed to know that, but I think that you do see things like that in other farm-based memoirs and stories. So again, is it there because it's true, or is it there because he's being shocking and this will offend the regime? I don't know. And whether it matters will depend on, you know, how comfortable you are with the possibility that those are actual stories. So. And finally, I read a book that is such an odd format for the story that it is, that it's kind of fantastic. And that is Frank, The Story of a Forgotten Dictatorship by Ximo Abadía. I don't have the translator's name on me, but I'll list it below. The author-illustrator of this is a children's book writer and illustrator, and a number of his books for children have been translated as well. But what's really interesting here is that he uses exactly the same style that he uses for his children's picture books to talk about Francisco Franco, the dictator who ruled Spain from the 30s to the 70s. And it's told in the incredibly simple language of a children's story. There's a bit about where he's using shapes as a metaphor, but a lot of it talking about people who were killed, talking about people who were driven into exile, is just, it's such a fascinating way to tell such a serious story. And this is not a book that is a children's book, because kids will not get this, but it is playing with the fact that a couple of generations were essentially asked to forget about this, and his push is that people should remember that this happened, and happened not that long ago. And yeah, it is just fascinating. Hopefully I'll have inserted some images from the book here, because it's hard to describe without showing you the images. It is just a fantastic piece of work. Now, I think some people have gone into this expecting something closer to a piece of graphic journalism or a comic book, and that's not what this is. This is very much the format of a children's picture book telling the story of a dictator, and it's brilliant, but you have to be aware that you are not going to get something that's going to have depth to the text. The depth is to the art, and the art is very metaphorical. It's not straightforward for the most part, but just a really fantastic style choice for this. I just thought it was really brilliant. So if you're at all interested in this kind of thing, it is well worth picking up. Just really, really interesting style choice for the subject matter. So good stuff. All right, so I think I'm going to cut it off here. And yeah, if you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you think. If you were taking part in the reading group of Before Night Falls, I'd love to hear your opinions and how you found the discussion on that one. And what's your favorite book from Charco Press? Because I still have about 10 other books from them out of the library right now that I will get to eventually. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.